So now that we've set up our cache protocol to define the two function signatures, at least, that we want to take advantage of, our cache isn't really going to have any functionality beyond these two guys. We are just setting up an interface for a key value store. The fact that this is defined in a protocol rather than the object itself or the class itself that we're going to make is great because it allows us to have some flexibility around how specifically we load an object or how specifically we save it, which is the flexibility we need to make two implementations that have the same interface here. One is keyed archiver based and one is user defaults based. And this is nice because if we move back over to to-do list view controller and we add a property on here, and let's say we say let cache, make it an object of type cache protocol. What do we have here? Let's actually make it a var, and we're going to make it optional for right now, but we're going to change that briefly. Let's say either way, let's say we set up an object here that is of type cache protocol. That will give us an opportunity to stub out our load and save functions. Let's say we want to implement save. We would just do something like the following: self.cache.save object, and we're going to save our items array, and we're going to save it to a particular key. We can decide what that is at some point later on. And that's pretty much as simple as it gets. And that allows us to kind of move any details or implementation-specific things about how we're saving it into the object that we eventually build to implement the cache protocol. And let's say we want to also augment this here. Let's call it an object. Let's say we want to load this object. So we would say self.cache.load object for key, and we would pass in the same cache key. And this is, as you'll remember, this could be an object or it could be nil. So we would probably want to say, what's going on here? It's not used. OK, so we probably want to say if let object is equal to object, then do something with it. So this basically allows us to unwrap the object we get here into a non-nil value if that is something that exists, which would then in turn allow us to say self.items is equal to object. But we probably want to do one more thing here. We want to say as NS array. So if we're able to get an object out of the cache, and if it's of type NS array, then we want to actually set the initial value of our items array to be that object. And we've got one error here, which says we can't assign a value of type NS array to a value of type NS mutable array. And that basically means that we've set up our items variable to be a mutable array so that we can add and remove things from it, which means that when we get a potential value of this array out of the cache, we need to make sure it's mutable before we set items to that value. So we would just say NS mutable array, and we would pass in an array like so. We could actually just rename this to make this a little clearer. So we could say get the value, if there is one, for this particular cache key out of our cache and store it in object. At that point, it's either an object or it's nil. Then try to convert that object to an NS array. So if it's nil, then that's not going to work. If it's non-nil but not NS array, that's not going to work either, which means that this will never be executed, which means that our array will just remain an empty array from the outset. But if those conditions are both true, like if it's non-nil and if it is NS array, we'll have a value here, and we can then say convert that value into mutable array and save it in items, which is exactly what we want. And in that way, in those few simple lines of code, we've really stubbed out the body. I'm going to get rid of these print statements. we've stubbed out the bodies of our load and save functions so that they're actually doing things for us. But what's not happening yet is things aren't being saved and loaded because we haven't actually provided a mechanism to do that. We haven't actually created an object that implements our protocol, which is evident up here because we're defining this variable of a particular type, but we're not, setting it equal to something like we do in the items variable right above. We say the initial value for this is actually an empty NS mutable array, but the initial value for this is synonymous with nil. Which is safe because it's optional and we're calling it like it's optional here. So we could build and run the code and it really just wouldn't do anything. We can actually, we'll get back to that in a minute. So the next step in this journey is to make sure that we can set the initial value of our cache variable to an instance of an object that implements our cache protocol. Before we do that, I want to do one item of housekeeping, which is anytime you have a raw string value in more than one place, it's generally a good idea to move it into a constant value somewhere up at the top of the file, for instance. We're doing this with cell identifier. We can also do this with cache key. And this will just allow me to ensure that the string value is in one location. You could also make this a static variable if you would like. Okay, so with that, we'll wrap it up for this video and we'll move on to the next one, which is really about implementing our cache protocol. How do we create an object that implements a protocol and instantiate it here?